We're now on Daf Lamed Aleph Amid Beis. The Gemara is going to present what seems to be a contradiction between the Reisha and the Seifa. We sensed it already intuitively. Ha'amrit Reisha, and the Reisha says, Ein mevakim eitzim klal. You're not allowed to cut down, from larger piece of wood to create smaller logs of wood. No ifs, ands, and buts, and no exceptions or qualifications. The Seifa, on the other hand, postulates that although there's certain professional utensils that you're not allowed to use, but you are allowed to cut down the larger piece of wood to be mevakea eitz to make smaller logs if you use a kofitz, for example. Omar Rabbi Yehuda Mar Shmuel, how can I reconcile the Reisha and the Seifa? Chisurei mechzerei v'achi ketani. In this case, we have to add a piece that was omitted from the Mishnah. Ein mevakim min hasvar shel koros. Svar is when they took beams and they set one on top of the other, laying down on the ground. They piled them up one on top of the other so they shouldn't get bent out of shape. And these are beams that have a certain value to them. They're expensive. They are designated for the purpose of building a binyan. They're not cheap wood that's suitable, that's designated for burning in the fireplace, for asaka. And therefore we have what's called mukta machmas chisaron kis. You may recall that we discussed a case of something of value that is designated and locked up, and we're not allowed to use that on Shabbos. It's got the status of mukta, that's chisaron kis. We don't want to lose money. Meaning even after the Korah broke on Yontif, and now it's no longer fit for binyan because it's broken, you can only use it as firewood. Nevertheless, Bein Hashmashos going into Shabbos, it was not a broken piece of a beam, and therefore it was designated for binyan. And we have a principle called migu diskatsoy lebein hashmachos diskatsoy lekuliyoma, that if it's muktzah going into Shabbos, it's muktzah for the entire Shabbos. Now this reflects the unique sheet of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds for muktzah. Rabbi Shimon disagrees. He doesn't accept muktzah, and therefore, like for example, if you have a ner that you lit on Erev Shabbos, if it extinguishes on Shabbos, you're allowed to use the shemen shebener. And here too, we're going to have to assume that our Mishnah here reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda. According to Rabbi Shimon, this would not be mukta, because when a korah breaks, we have to assume that it wasn't a sturdy, solid piece of wood. It was omed l'shvira, and therefore it's not muktzah. Avol mevakim min hakorah shenishbar me'erev yontif. If a beam broke before yontif, so going into yontif, it's already omed la'asaka, it's not for binyan, it's broken, then it's not muktzah. Now we get to the Seifa. Ukshehein mevakim, if this beam fell and broke on Erev Yontif, and now you want to cut it down to size, whittle it into small pieces of wood for the fireplace, then ein mevakim lo b'kardim lo b'megera ela b'kofitz. So there is no contradiction between the Reisha and the Seifa. Tanya nami hachi, and we have this explicitly in a Beitza. Ein mevakim eitzim lo min hasvar shel koros All these are mukta machmas chisaron kis, lefisha eno min amuch. Mishnah says, "V'lo mevakim b'kora b'kardum." Now, kardum has two sides to it. On one side of the saw, we have what's called a wider side, which is called in the Gemara's language tzad nakvus, and that's used when you have a piece of wood of eights and you want to cut it in its width. Then you use that side, which is rachav, which is wider. It has a more narrow side, the other side, if you flip over the axe, and that's used for a more subtle kind of thing. It's tsar, it's narrow, and you could use it to cut very thin. Like, for example, you want to make these chatichos ktanos, these very small pieces of wood, of logs for your fire. And our Mishnah says, you're not allowed to be mavakea bekardu. What does it mean? Rav Chinino bar Shalemia, which made the Lo shanu ela b'tzad nakvu shelo. You're not allowed to use the wider side because that's what you use to cut a piece of wood on its width. And that's a meleches uman. Avol tzad zachru shelo, meaning the side that is narrow, which are used to cut pieces of wood in a very fine kind of slice, that's mutter. Then you could be mevakeya, because that's not a maisa uman. Everybody, even whether you're professionally preparing it for building or you're a regular balabas, you have your own campfire in your as part of your kitchen, your cooking facilities, and you use the tzad zachrus to cut down your piece of wood. So Gemara asks Shita. It doesn't make sense that Rav Chinina would tell me that which is obvious. The kofitz tanan, the Mishnah itself says that you're allowed to use a kofitz, and the reason for that is because both sides are narrow and very sharp, and it's not a kli uman. It's not used by professionals for cutting wood. So why does Rav have to tell me that which is explicit in the Mishnah? Because in the case of an axe, that side of the axe that is mechudadim and ktsarim, that's called a zakra side, that side is exactly the same as a kofitz. Ma'odetema hani mili kofitz l'chudei. If you have a kofitz which is very sharp and narrow on both sides, then you're allowed to use it to be mevakeh eitzim on yot. Aval kardum. In the case of a kardum, where one side of the kardum is a tzad nakvus, which means it's very wide, and it's only used by the umnum, by the experts, in order to prepare wood for building purposes, even though the other side is a tzad kofitz. Ema, I might have thought, migo dahai gisa osur, hai gisa nami osur. It's not the maisa of bikua that will determine whether or not you're allowed to do it, but rather it's the chefts of the kli. And if the chefts of the kli is designated even for cutting the width of these beams as a meleches uman, then once you pick up that axe, I don't care which side you're using, it already looks like you're using a kli umnus, and that's forbidden on Yontif Kamash Malan. Therefore, Reb Chinina wants to teach us that this is not so. You're allowed to be mevakeh eitzim with the narrow part of the axe. Ika de mastile asefa. Some say that Rabbi Shlema, Rabbi Chinina bar Shlemya, was making a comment on the Sefer. of our Mishnah. The Sefer says, Ein mevakim ela bekofetz. You're only allowed to cut down the wood for the purpose of asaka with a butcher's knife. Amar Rav Chinina bar Shlemya mishmei derav lo shanu. This law that you could be lenient and allow bikua with a kofetz ela bizachur shalom. Only when he uses that side which is very, very sharp. Let me backtrack again. Lo shanu, when did the Sefer the Mishnah limit your heter bikua to a kofetz? That's only with regard to the tzad zachrus, the very sharp side, which is domer, which is not at all similar to a kli umnus. Aval b'nakva shalo asu. So I go back to my first interpretation. Sorry. When does the Mishnah allow you to use a kofetz? That's only because the kofetz has a very sharp blade, and it's not used by the umnim. But if there's a tzad nakvus, which means that that part of the kli is wide, also, because then it looks like a Maisa Uma. So whereas Pshita, certainly we would only allow the tzad nachrus, zachrus. V'lo b'karim tnan, after all, the Mishnah says we're only going to allow you to use a kardum that's, that in the case of a kardum, in our Mishnah, it says you're not allowed to use a kardum because it has a rosh rachav, it has a side that is wide and it's a kli umnus, and hence you're not allowed to use it on yontif to be mefakea eitzim. So we should derive from that the obvious conclusion that the reason why you're allowed to use a kofetz is only insofar as the kofetz has a tzad katsar, which is not similar to a kardum. So Gemara answers, Mao the Tema, I would have thought, if not for the statement of Rav Chinina, Hani Mili, even though they prohibited to be mefakea kardum, that's only kardum which is wide on both sides. Aval bekofetz v'kardum, if you have a kardum which is like a kofetz, which means that one side of it is tsar, is narrow. Emam, I might think, migo de high gisa shari, high gisa nami shari. We have a din in the chefza, and if this kli is not generally not necessarily, at least, used by an uman exclusively, because it has the tzad tsar, is therefore we could be matir using this kli even from the other side. It's not nikar. Nobody knows which side you're using. Hamash Malan, Finino wants to tell me that you're not allowed to be mefakea b'tzad rachav, on the wide side. It's nira kimaleches uma. And now we start the Mishnah in the middle of Lamed Aleph Amid Beis. Bayeshu mole b'peiros. On Erev Yontif, he locked up his fruits on all sides in a way that he would not be able to get access to the fruits. But on Yontif, as luck would have it, nifchas. Somehow it was broken. And now, as a result of the fact that the walls that surround this bias broke down, or one of the walls, he now has access to the peiros. Is no tell me makom apchas. What does that mean? We're going to allow him to take these peiros. And we're not going to say, well, since in order to get access to the peiros, he would have had to break down the house before it fell on its own. So therefore, you're not allowed to break down a house on Yom Tov. That's called Meleches Soser. And therefore, he's Mesiach Das. He doesn't have any intention or any anticipation of getting access to the Peiros. And therefore, they should be considered Muktzah. No. The Mishnah establishes no tel mimokum apchas. It's not considered Muktzah. In other words, we're talking about a kind of a bias where he could have broken down the bias without violating Meleches Stira. And therefore, lo yisiach daito. And Reb Meir Omer, he goes one step further, and he says, Af poches lechatchila b'notel. Even if the walls of the house did not fall down, London Bridge is falling, didn't fall down on their own, nevertheless, he can break it down because there's no Meleches Soser here. So the Gemara immediately asks, you have an oil and you're breaking it down. That's Meleches Stira. And you're not allowed to do that on Yom Tov. Meleches Soser, even if you do it l'tzorech ochel nefesh, is not mutter. Why? Tzorech ochel nefesh means that you're doing a positive act. Here what you're doing is removing something in order that's a barrier that's preventing you from getting access to the peiros. That's not a Meleches ochel nefesh. Amar Rav Nechumi bar Adam or Shmuel. The Mishnah is not talking about a case where you have a structure, a complete binyan gamur, where breaking it down would be a prohibition of Meleches Soser min HaTorah, but rather be Avera, not an Avera with an ayin and a beis, Avera with an aleph and a vav. Avera de livni. Avera de livni means they took bricks and they piled them one on top of the other without putting a layer of concrete between one brick and the one above it. They just simply stacked up levanim, bricks, one on top of the other without any chibur, nothing connects them. There's no concrete, no tit. And that's not considered an oil. That's just a pile of bricks. And therefore, you're allowed to be soserid and break it apart in order to get access to the peiros. Gemara says, Eini, are you telling me I'm allowed to move stones that are not connected by concrete? For Omar Rav Nachman, what are you going to do with the statement of Rav Nachman? Hani livni, these bricks, the isur mi binyana. Isur means notar. Notar means surplus. Like, let's say, for example, you have certain bricks, you build the building, and now you have a surplus of extra bricks. Those bricks, shari litultinu b'shabsa, hol v'chazi lemizgalai. Those extra bricks, after he finishes the building, are allowed to be moved on Shabbos. And why? Because you could make a chair out of them. You could sit on them. And they no longer are omdim lebinyan because he already built his building. So that these bricks now have what we call a shem kli, and a kli is not muktzah. There's always a tiltal on kalim. However, sharginu, if he went ahead and he took these stones, these bricks that were surplus after he finished the building, and he piled them one on top of the other, vadai aktzinu. There's no question that he revealed his intention, that he still wants to use them for binyan. Maybe he's going to build another building next door, and therefore you're not allowed to be metal to them. So now Shmuel said that our Mishnah is referring to a situation of avonim, stones and bricks that are laid one on top, that are piled one on top of the other. And in that case, Rabbi Meir allowed you to be soser, to take it apart in order to get access to the peiros. Okay, I understand it's not a violation of Meleches Soser, but on the other hand, you're violating the Isur of Muktzah. Because we saw in this brisa that once you pile up the stones one on top of the other, well, I don't know if it's a brisa, statement of Rav Nachman at least, then that's considered as if he was makta midaito. Gila daito shemakta osan lebinyan. So how can you tell me, Shmuel, that in a case where he piles the stones one on top of the other, a mayor allows you to take it apart? What do you mean take it apart? It's a violation of these mukta. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Zera, that which Rabbi Meir was matir, he allowed you to be sosa the bias when there's no chibur, there's no connection between one brick and the one below it with pit. That's only b'yontif where there's a mitzvah simchas yontif, and the Isa Mukta is only the Rabbanon, and for the sake of simchas yontif, they were matir for the purpose of eating these peros, the Isa Mukta. And this should not shock us because there are malachos which are allowed to do them l'tzarech ochel nefesh. So if the Torah allows you to do malacha l'tzarech ochel nefesh, the Rabbanan will allow you to violate muktzah l'tzarech ochel nefesh. Avol lo b'Shabbos. But Rav Nachman is talking about a case of Shabbos, and he's saying that he piled one brick on top of the other. He was makta midaito for binyan, surplus bricks. And then you're not allowed to be metal to them. Because in such a case, he was makta osam midaito. And on Shabbos, we're not going to allow you for the sake of achila, in other words, to get access to the fruits that are inside the binyan, to take apart the binyan and violate the Isa Mukta. We cannot waive the Isa Mukta on Shabbos because there's no such thing as l'tzorech ochel nefesh to be matir malach on Shabbos. Our precedent to be matir muktzah for the sake of simchas yontiv is the fact that the Torah allows malacha for ochel nefesh on yontiv. There's no parallel heter on Shabbos. Tanya nami hachi, and that's in fact what we learned in the Beitza to support Rav Zera, Rabbi Meir, Omer. Not only are you allowed to take the peros when it breaks down on its own, but af poches lechatchila, he is allowed according to Rabbi Meir, and this Beitza reflects the shita Rabbi Meir, of course, and he quotes Rabbi Meir, is lechatchila, you're allowed to be poches af lechatchila, v'notel, and he's allowed to take the peros, but the yontif amru, avol lo b'Shabbos. This is a heter of tiltul muktzah for the sake of simchas yontif. Omar Shmuel. Okay, this Gemara of Omar Shmuel, I will put online in about, hopefully, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, because this is the introduction to tomorrow's daf, the Shabbos daf, which is daf Lamed Beis. So we're going to stop here, and I'll take this opportunity to wish you a good Shabbos. We're starting the Torah again, so we'll get new chizuk, a new round, starting with Breishis, and in Mitzvah on Yom Rishon, we'll have our Daf Yomi Shir regular time for Daf Lamed Gimel, and I'll see you then. Thank you so much.